Nicholas Brooks built an empire by walking away from anything that made him feel too much, until one summer afternoon, 3 little girls with his eyes shattered 5 years of silence with a single look. Nicholas Brooks had everything. At 32, he was already the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Los Angeles, with a net worth that made headlines and a schedule that rarely left space for anything unrelated to success. His life was precise, calculated, and carefully protected from vulnerability. He lived in a penthouse overlooking the Pacific, his days ruled by data and dollars, not feelings. Emotions, in his mind, were liabilities. And love? That was something for people who had time to lose. He didn't. But then there was Julia. He had met her at a startup networking event, of all places. She wasn't from his world, not in the way that mattered to investors or shareholders. She wasn't rich, didn't know the language of venture capital or IPOs. She was an art school graduate who taught painting to kids and volunteered at community centers on weekends. She laughed with her whole body, asked real questions, and looked at him like she wasn't impressed by anything he owned. And somehow, that drew him in. For 6 months, they dated quietly. No press. No red carpets. Just late-night walks, takeout on the floor of her apartment, her head resting on his chest while they listened to music he never thought he'd enjoy. With her, he felt real, stripped of all the layers he had built. But even then, somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a wall, an invisible line he refused to cross. Then came the moment he never expected. Julia sat across from him in the small cafe they always went to after her classes. Her hands were wrapped around a paper cup of tea, her fingers twitching nervously. She didn't draw it out. She just looked at him and said, "I'm pregnant." Her voice was soft, but steady. Her eyes, usually filled with light, searched his face for something, hope, maybe, or fear she could live with. Nicholas didn't speak. Not for a full 10 seconds. It wasn't shock that froze him, it was the sudden, suffocating flood of everything he had worked to avoid. A child. A future he couldn't control. A bond that couldn't be undone by a signed check or a closed door. The fear hit him harder than any business failure ever had. "I can't do this," he said finally, and even as the words left his mouth, he hated himself for how cold they sounded. "I'm not ready. I didn't sign up for this." Julia didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, her shoulders tightening. "I didn't ask you to," she replied quietly. "But I thought, maybe you'd want to know." He didn't stay long after that. He left a week later without another meeting, without closure, just an envelope. Inside, a check that could have covered everything for years, and a short note, impersonal, typed, sterile. Julia stared at it for a long time. She didn't cash the check. Not right away. Not because of pride, but because her heart was still trying to understand how someone who once touched her like she mattered could leave her in the cold for something so deeply human. She moved out of the city a month later. No contact. No updates. Just silence. And Nicholas? He buried himself in work. He doubled his investments, signed 3 major international deals, and expanded his company to 5 new markets. On the outside, he was thriving. But late at night, when the city lights flickered through his penthouse windows, there were moments, short, sharp, unwelcome, when he remembered the warmth of her hand, the sound of her voice, and the choice he made that couldn't be undone. The day the girls were born, the rain wouldn't stop. It came down in long, heavy sheets, turning the roads to rivers and painting the windows of the small county hospital with streaks of silver. Julia lay in a stiff hospital bed in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and worn-out hope. She had arrived alone. No family. No friends. No one sitting in the vinyl chair next to her holding her hand or pacing the room nervously. Just the sound of monitors beeping steadily, nurses calling out codes, and the weight of contractions that came too soon. She was only 32 weeks along, and the doctors were concerned. The babies were small, too small, but they were coming anyway. There was no stopping them. Julia had spent the last 7 months doing everything in her power to keep them safe, working 2 jobs, skipping meals so she could afford prenatal vitamins, and praying, constantly, that the stress wouldn't reach them. But her body had reached its limit. When the nurse told her it was time, Julia whispered their names under her breath, Amber, Lily, and Hope, like a promise, like a spell. She had chosen them long ago, not just for their beauty but for what they meant. Amber, for the warmth she never stopped trying to give them. Lily, for purity and new beginnings. And Hope, because it was the only thing that hadn't left her. The delivery was difficult. Each baby was born quickly, one after the other, their cries soft, uncertain, almost questioning the world they'd been brought into. The medical team worked fast, placing each newborn into a separate incubator. Julia caught only fleeting glimpses, tiny fists, wet curls, pink skin, but those flashes burned themselves into her heart. Blue eyes. All 3 of them. Deep, striking, impossible to ignore blue eyes. The same as his. She didn't cry until it was over. Not when they told her the babies would have to stay in the NICU, not when they wheeled her back to her room. But that night, lying in the quiet, under a thin hospital blanket, she finally broke. Not from pain, but from something heavier. Joy, fear, love, grief, everything collided inside her. She pressed her hand to her stomach, already empty, and whispered, "I will never leave you." The days in the NICU turned into weeks. Julia never left the hospital. She slept in chairs, ate from vending machines, and learned the names of every nurse on the floor. She read to the girls through the incubator glass, sang lullabies when the machines quieted, and whispered stories about the world she wanted them to see. Each day, she held them for as long as she was allowed, feeling the rhythm of their hearts against her chest. When they were finally strong enough to go home, she bundled them in second-hand onesies and buckled them into a donated stroller, her hands trembling not from exhaustion but from something like pride. She didn't have much waiting for them outside the hospital, just a small rented room in an old house, a few boxes of clothes from a shelter, and a makeshift crib made from cardboard and blankets, but she had them. And that was everything. As they grew, people often stopped Julia on the street. They stared at the girls, always asking if they were triplets, always marveling at their identical faces and luminous blue eyes. She would smile politely, nod, and keep walking. What could she say? That their father was a man who had never seen them, never held them, never knew the weight of their tiny bodies in his arms. That they looked like ghosts of someone who once kissed her with promises he never meant to keep. But Julia didn't speak of Nicholas. Not to the girls. Not to anyone. He was a chapter closed, sealed behind a door she refused to reopen. Her focus was survival. Raising 3 daughters on a single income meant rationing groceries, taking night shifts at a diner, and skipping her own doctor's appointments to afford theirs. The girls shared everything: clothes, books, birthday cakes. They wore matching pink t-shirts from a charity drive and played with second-hand toys that Julia cleaned until they shone like new. And yet, the house was filled with laughter. The girls giggled over coloring books, made up songs, and took turns pretending to be the mom when playing with dolls. They fought over who got to stir pancake batter and which one would sit closest to Julia during movie night. There was so much love, raw, unfiltered, and real. Julia gave them everything she had, and in return, they gave her the strength to keep going. Still, in the quiet moments, when the lights were off and the city hummed in the distance, Julia would sometimes find herself staring at their sleeping faces and wondering what it would be like, if only he had stayed. If only he had met them. If only he knew. But those were dangerous thoughts, and Julia had long ago learned that dreaming of what could have been did nothing to change what was. So she kissed each girl's forehead and whispered the same thing she always did: "I've got you. We've got each other." And for now, that was enough. Summer in Los Angeles was unforgiving. The pavement radiated heat, and the air felt like it hadn't moved in hours. Julia wiped the sweat from her forehead with the edge of her worn t-shirt as she guided the stroller toward the bus stop. The girls were too big for it now, but when they were tired or the heat became too much, they took turns sitting two at a time while the third held on to the side. Today, all three insisted on walking, holding hands in a perfect line as they skipped in matching pink t-shirts and slightly too big jeans. Their shoes were scuffed, their hair tied back in uneven ponytails, and their faces were flushed from the sun. But they were smiling. Always smiling. They were on their way to the downtown welfare office. Rent was 2 weeks overdue, and the landlord had stopped answering her texts. Julia knew she was running out of time. She'd picked up an extra shift at the diner last night and delivered food until nearly 2 a.m., but it still wouldn't be enough. She didn't want to bring the girls with her, she hated making them sit for hours in those bleak waiting rooms, but she had no one to watch them, and no choice. As they waited at the corner for the crosswalk light to change, Julia crouched down and adjusted Hope's sandal strap. "Okay, girls, we'll be quick," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Amber's damp forehead. "After this, we'll get ice cream. Just a small one." That was enough to reignite their energy. They nodded in unison, grinning as if the thought of vanilla cones erased the heat and the stress and the hunger in their bellies. Across the street, a pair of glass doors opened with a rush of cool air. Nicholas Brooks stepped out of the towering steel and glass building, still finishing a call on his Bluetooth. His dark gray suit fit him like armor, and the sunlight caught in his perfectly styled brown hair. His blue eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, but his jaw was tight, voice clipped. He was frustrated, something about a missed delivery to a hotel project in Miami. The assistant on the other end kept apologizing, but Nicholas wasn't in the mood for mistakes. As he walked, he instinctively scanned the street, barely taking in the people around him. The usual blur of faces, noise, and heat. But then he saw them. 3 girls, identical in face, each with large, wide blue eyes that made him slow down. Something strange struck him, the symmetry of them, their expressions, the way they moved together. He blinked, trying to shake the feeling, and then his gaze shifted to the woman standing behind them. She was thinner than he remembered, and her hair was pulled back in a messy braid, but her profile was unmistakable. Julia. For a moment, the noise of the city dulled. His steps faltered. The phone call drifted into static in his ear. His chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Shock. Guilt. Julia didn't see him at first. She was helping Lily climb up onto the bench at the bus stop. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. Hers widened slightly, not with surprise, but with a kind of weary resignation, like she had known this day might come. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She simply stared at him, calm and steady, as if daring him to look away. Nicholas pulled off his sunglasses slowly, as if needing to confirm that what he was seeing wasn't a trick. The girls turned to look at him too, sensing their mother's stillness. For a few long seconds, no one said a word. He looked at them, really looked, and the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Those eyes. His eyes. All 3 of them. It was undeniable. He took a step forward, breath caught in his throat. "Julia," he said, barely louder than a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed a hand on Hope's shoulder and gave a small, tired nod. Then she met his gaze and said quietly, "They're 5." Just 2 words, but they landed with the force of a confession and a reckoning. Nicholas stared at the girls, who now looked at him with quiet curiosity. No fear, no recognition. To them, he was just a man in a suit. A stranger. He wanted to say something, anything, but all that came out was a shaky breath. "They're mine?" he asked, knowing the answer before the words left his mouth. Julia didn't nod this time. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any confirmation. Then, the bus pulled up with a loud hiss of brakes. She looked at him one last time, a mix of sadness and strength in her eyes, and said, "We have somewhere to be." She guided the girls up the steps one by one. Nicholas didn't move. He just stood there, the heat rising around him, watching the doors close. As the bus pulled away, he saw all three girls press their hands to the window, peering out at him with innocent interest. They smiled. He didn't. He couldn't. His heart was thudding so hard it hurt. He had walked out of her life 5 years ago with a check and a goodbye. Now, three blue-eyed faces stared back at him through a dusty bus window. And all he could do was watch them disappear into the city. Nicholas didn't move for a long time after the bus disappeared around the corner. The rush of the street returned around him, honking cars, footsteps, snippets of conversation, but he stood frozen on the sidewalk like a man hit by a wave he hadn't seen coming. His phone was still pressed to his ear, but the call had long since ended. He pulled it away, looked down at it blankly, and shoved it into his pocket as if it no longer mattered. His thoughts were a blur, his mind circling one image over and over again: 3 girls, same blue eyes, same expressions, same impossible truth. 5 years. 5 years, and he hadn't known. 5 years, and she had raised them alone. And they looked just like him. He didn't go back to the office that day. Instead, he sat in his car, parked on a side street, the air conditioning on full blast, but it didn't help. He couldn't get warm. His fingers drummed restlessly on the steering wheel. He kept seeing Julia's face, not angry, not bitter, just tired. That hurt more than if she had screamed at him. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't even looked surprised. And that quiet acceptance in her eyes haunted him. He tried to convince himself she should have told him. He had a right to know. But deep down, he already knew why she hadn't. He had made it clear back then, crystal clear, that he wanted no part in any of it. He'd handed her a check and walked away like it was a business transaction, like she and the unborn child didn't mean anything beyond inconvenience. And she had taken that message and built a life without him. A hard life, by the look of it. And now there were 3 little girls who looked like him, moved like him, breathed like him, and they had no idea who he was. That night, he didn't go home. He drove through the city, aimlessly, windows down, as if the air could clear his mind. But nothing could. He found himself parked outside the diner near Koreatown where Julia had once worked when they were dating. He didn't even know if she was still there. But he sat there for an hour, watching waitresses come and go, none of them her. He didn't go in. He didn't ask. He just drove away again, feeling heavier with each mile. He went to bed at 3 a.m. but didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, little hands pressed to the bus window, identical grins that pierced through 5 years of silence. The next morning, he made a decision. He didn't send his assistant. He didn't hire a private investigator. He got up, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt for the first time in what felt like forever, and went back downtown. He checked the bus route. He found the welfare office. He asked questions. Politely. Patiently. And when the receptionist hesitated, unsure if she could give out information, he said, "Please. I think I just saw my children for the first time in my life." That changed everything. A few hours later, he spotted Julia outside a small corner grocery store. She was coming out with a bag of bread, milk, and what looked like instant noodles. The girls weren't with her this time. She looked exhausted. Her steps were slow. Her shoulders hunched against the heat. He didn't approach her immediately. He stood across the street, watching, unsure what he was even doing. But then she saw him. Their eyes met again. This time, there was no surprise at all. She looked at him for a long moment, then crossed the street and stopped in front of him, her arms tightening around the grocery bag. "What do you want, Nicholas?" she asked, not coldly, but without softness. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come easily. I saw them, he said finally. Yesterday. I didn't know / Julia, I didn't know there were 3. I didn't know anything. No, she said, her voice flat. You didn't want to know. He flinched. It was true. He couldn't deny it. I made a mistake, he said, and his voice cracked for the first time in years. I thought I was doing what was right, for me. I was scared. But seeing them, he stopped, swallowed hard. They look like me. They are you, she said quietly. 3 different versions of the man who walked away. There was silence between them, stretched thin and painful. He didn't try to defend himself. There was nothing to defend. I want to help, he said, the words slow, unsure. I don't mean money. I mean, I want to know them. I want them to know me. Julia's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened just a little. You don't get to drop in and fix this in a week. They're not a project. They're not broken. I know, he said. I know that now. She sighed, looked down at her bag, then back at him. You can see them. But slowly. Carefully. And not as some rich guy who shows up in a limo with presents. They don't need more things. They need time. Truth. Consistency. I can give that, he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it without knowing exactly how. Julia looked at him one last time, searching for something in his face. Then she turned and walked away down the sidewalk without another word. He didn't follow. He just stood there, heart pounding, watching the woman he had lost, and the path back to the family he had never known he needed. The first time Nicholas came to the apartment, he didn't bring gifts. No flowers, no toys, no promises wrapped in expensive boxes. He brought himself, dressed plainly in jeans and a soft gray shirt, his hands visibly empty and his heart pounding so loud it drowned out every step on the creaky stairwell. Julia had given him the address a week earlier, her tone measured, her rules clear, no sudden appearances, no press, and no confusion for the girls. He had nodded to everything, grateful for even the smallest opening. Now he stood outside the peeling blue door of their second-floor unit, listening to the muffled laughter on the other side. His hands trembled when he raised them to knock. Julia answered with a calm expression, her long brown hair pulled into a loose bun and a dish towel slung over her shoulder. Her eyes met his with a steadiness that grounded him. She didn't smile, but she didn't shut the door either. Behind her, the apartment was small and cluttered, but warm. He could smell pasta sauce and hear cartoons echoing from the other room. They don't know who you are yet, she said in a low voice. They think you're a friend from my old job. He nodded without argument. He didn't deserve to be called anything more. Not yet. When the girls appeared, 3 matching figures in their usual pink t-shirts and denim shorts, he forgot how to breathe. They moved like waves, together, fluid, full of life. Amber was the first to speak. Hi, she chirped, tilting her head with a grin that nearly brought him to his knees. You have the same eyes as us. Lily giggled and echoed, yeah, are you our twin? Hope stood back, more cautious, her gaze intense as she studied him with the quiet wisdom that only 5-year-olds can possess. Nicholas crouched down to their level and smiled gently. Maybe I am, he said. I've been told I have pretty good eyes. Julia watched from the doorway as the girls dragged him toward their art corner, showing him scribbled drawings taped to the wall. There were castles, unicorns, and one image of a stick-figure family with 4 people. He wondered if he had been drawn and erased more than once over the years. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, listening as they talked over each other, trying to impress him with how many stars they could name, how fast they could recite the alphabet backwards, and how they all hated peas but loved ketchup. He had been in boardrooms with billionaires and felt less pressure than he did in that moment, trying to be enough for 3 5-year-olds. That evening, he stayed for dinner. Julia served pasta with sauce from scratch, and the girls insisted he sit next to them. He offered to help with dishes, and though she declined, he stayed in the kitchen and talked to her while she cleaned. Her guard was still up, but something in her posture was softer than before. "They don't know what a father is supposed to be," she said while drying a plate. "I didn't want them to grow up expecting someone who wouldn't come." He nodded slowly. "They'll learn. I'm not going anywhere this time." He kept coming back, twice a week, then more. He read bedtime stories. He fixed the broken leg on their kitchen table. He walked them to the park and learned which one was the fastest, which one was the loudest, which one needed an extra hand to cross the street. He showed up even when he was tired, even when a big meeting loomed the next morning. The girls began to look for him in the window before he arrived. They began to draw 5 people in their family pictures. Amber once asked if he could help with her shoelaces and casually called him "Dad" before catching herself and blushing. He didn't correct her. He just knelt and tied the knot as gently as he could. One rainy night, as Julia stood at the window sipping tea, she spoke without turning around. "You know, I thought I hated you." Her voice was low and tired, not angry. "I thought I'd never let you near them. But now / I see them waiting for you. And laughing with you. And I don't know what to feel." Nicholas stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not forgiveness. Not a second chance. But I owe them everything I have left." She glanced at him then, and though her eyes were still cautious, they didn't push him away. Outside, the rain fell soft and steady, like the rhythm of something old starting again. And inside, for the first time in years, there was room to hope that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as broken as they once believed. It was nearly 6 months after that first visit when the past came knocking, not through a phone call or a headline, but through something far more ordinary, an envelope. Julia found it wedged into their apartment mailbox, thick and official, with the seal of the county courthouse in the corner. She opened it slowly, her hands already tense, her instincts telling her it was something that would shift the ground beneath her feet. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again. A court summons. A notice of overdue debts. Threat of legal action. And worst of all, a line buried halfway down the page, petition to evaluate custodial status. For a moment, the air left her lungs. She stood there in the stairwell, still holding the envelope, the noise of the city humming just beyond the building walls. She had always known something like this might happen. The debts were old, rent from the apartment before this one, unpaid hospital fees from the girls' NICU days, a forgotten loan she'd taken years ago just to cover diapers and medicine. She had paid what she could, when she could, but it had never been enough. Now someone had filed a motion to challenge her fitness as a parent. Her. The woman who hadn't missed a single bedtime in 5 years. The mother who had gone without meals so her children wouldn't feel hunger. The fear came like a wave, swift and choking. When Nicholas arrived later that evening, he found her sitting on the couch with the envelope in her lap, the lights off except for a single lamp glowing near the window. The girls were already asleep. She didn't look up right away. He didn't speak either. Instead, he knelt in front of her and gently touched her hand. She passed him the letter in silence. He read it carefully, his brow furrowing with every line. By the time he finished, his expression had hardened into something Julia hadn't seen before, not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold, focused determination. "This won't happen," he said, his voice low but steady. "They're not taking them from you. Ever." Julia didn't answer right away. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than usual. "I've fought for so long, Nicholas. I can't lose them. I won't survive that." "You won't have to," he replied. "You're not alone anymore." The next day, he called his legal team, his real legal team, the ones he reserved for acquisitions and international contracts, and told them the only case that mattered now was Julia's. Within hours, papers were filed. Court dates were confirmed. Statements were drafted. But it wasn't just about money. Nicholas insisted on attending every meeting himself. He sat with Julia during depositions. He answered every question with brutal honesty. He didn't try to clean up his past. He admitted he had left. He admitted he had been selfish and afraid. But then he described the girls in perfect detail, their favorite colors, the songs they danced to in the kitchen, the different ways they smiled when they were nervous or proud or trying to hide a secret. He spoke of Julia with unwavering respect. "She's the strongest person I've ever known," he told the judge. "She raised them when I didn't even have the courage to be in the room." In court, Julia sat straight-backed and calm, but her hands were clenched in her lap. She didn't cry. She answered every question clearly, explained her finances, her living situation, her work history. When asked if she had ever received consistent child support, she answered no without flinching. When asked if she regretted not contacting the father, she said, "He made it clear I was on my own. I didn't have time for disappointment, I had children to raise." The judge, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a weary expression, listened in silence. After the final statements, she sat back in her chair, folding her hands together. For a moment, the entire courtroom held its breath. "I've seen many cases," she said at last. "And too often, the ones who disappear never return. But today, I saw a man take responsibility not out of guilt, but out of love. And I saw a woman who never gave up, on her children, or on herself. Custody will not be altered. This family deserves peace, not punishment." Julia exhaled shakily, her body folding in on itself as relief took over. Nicholas reached for her hand under the table. She didn't pull away. Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to set, casting long golden rays across the sidewalk. The girls were waiting nearby with a family friend, their pink t-shirts bright in the fading light. When they spotted their mother, they ran to her, arms outstretched, laughter bursting like fireworks. Julia dropped to her knees and caught them all at once, tears streaming down her cheeks. Nicholas stood a few steps away, watching, unsure if he belonged in that circle of arms and joy. But then hope turned and reached for him without hesitation, grabbing his hand and pulling him in. "We did it," she squealed. And just like that, he was surrounded too. They weren't just his daughters by blood now. They were his daughters by choice, by effort, by the weight of everything he hadn't done before, and everything he was willing to do from now on. And Julia, looking up at him through tears, gave him the smallest, truest smile he'd ever seen. A beginning, born from everything broken. A chance neither of them had expected, but both of them were finally ready to take. It was strange how quickly the extraordinary could become ordinary. Weeks after the court hearing, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. There were no looming deadlines from the courthouse, no fear of eviction, no emergency letters waiting in the mailbox. Instead, there were packed lunches and mismatched socks, morning cartoons and arguments over which of the girls got to sit next to Nicholas at breakfast. The chaos was real, but it was a chaos Julia had always dreamed of, the kind that came with laughter and slammed doors and the sound of little feet racing across the floor. For the first time in years, she was not surviving. She was living. Nicholas became a constant in their lives. Not a visitor. Not a guest. He took the girls to school when Julia had early shifts, waited at ballet practice, learned how to braid hair, badly at first, but with practice, he improved. They made pancakes together every Sunday morning, and he taught them how to crack eggs without shattering the shells. It was messy, and loud, and far from perfect, but somehow perfect because of that. At first, Julia kept her distance emotionally, even as she let him into the day-to-day world of their daughters. She wasn't cold, just guarded. She still remembered the sting of being left behind. The wound wasn't fresh anymore, but it had left a scar. Sometimes when she watched Nicholas reading to the girls, or when she saw how naturally they leaned against him, laughing and whispering secrets in his ear. A part of her wanted to believe he was the man they needed. But the fear still lingered. What if this was temporary? What if one day, he realized how much work this all was and disappeared again? One night, after the girls had gone to bed and the apartment had settled into its usual hum of quiet and soft lamplight, Julia sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of chamomile tea. Nicholas was across from her, flipping through a picture book one of the girls had left behind. They had begun to share these late-night moments more often, not out of obligation but because neither of them wanted to leave when the house finally fell silent. There was something sacred in the stillness after the storm of bedtime. Julia looked at him over the rim of her mug. "You know," she said, her voice low but clear, "I used to imagine what it would be like to raise them with someone. Not just anyone, someone who didn't run at the first sign of responsibility." She hesitated, then added, "I just never thought it would be you." Nicholas didn't flinch. He closed the book and met her eyes. "I never thought it would be me either," he admitted. "I thought walking away made me strong. I thought staying detached meant I was in control. But the truth is, I've never been more scared in my life than the day I saw them for the first time." Julia nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I'm still scared," he said honestly. "But not of them. Not of this. I'm scared of losing it. Of doing something wrong again." "You're doing more right than wrong," she said quietly. The silence between them stretched, not tense but thoughtful. Nicholas looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I don't expect forgiveness, Julia. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I'm here. I want to be here. For them. And if you'll let me, for you too." She studied him, her heart warring with itself. He had changed, that much was clear. Not just in words, but in the way he moved through their lives, with care, with patience, with humility. The girls adored him. Not because he was rich or impressive, but because he made time for them, saw them, really saw them. And Julia, who had spent so long building walls around her heart, realized that maybe, just maybe, she wanted to let someone in again. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Don't say things you're not ready to prove." "I won't," he said. And this time, she believed him. That night, when Nicholas left, he kissed each girl on the forehead as they slept, then paused at the door with a look of quiet wonder. Julia stood beside him, arms folded loosely across her chest, watching him with a softness that hadn't been there before. He turned to her, and without saying a word, she gave him a slow nod. Outside, the city glowed with its usual restlessness, but inside that little apartment, something steady had begun to form, a kind of peace neither of them had known they were capable of. A home. Not built in marble or glass, but in bedtime stories, shared dinners, and second chances taken slowly, carefully, one day at a time. A full year had passed since Nicholas first stood frozen on that sunlit street, watching a bus pull away with three blue-eyed girls pressed against the window. The man who once built his life around silence, power, and control was now someone entirely different, still sharp, still commanding in a boardroom, but softer around the edges, fuller in the ways that mattered most. His calendar, once guarded like a fortress, now had gaps labeled school pickup, family night, and field trip. His colleagues noticed the change, and though some whispered, others quietly admired the evolution of a man who had finally figured out what legacy really meant. On a warm Saturday morning, the kind of day Los Angeles sometimes gave as a reward for surviving a brutal week, the apartment was alive with motion. The girls were in the living room, spreading crayons and colored paper across the floor, arguing playfully over which color should be used for the sun. Amber insisted on orange, Lily argued for yellow, and Hope, as usual, tried to mediate. The room smelled like cinnamon pancakes, the kind Nicholas had learned to make from Julia after 3 hilariously failed attempts. Julia stood in the kitchen, hair loose, wearing one of his old shirts as she stirred something on the stove. Her laugh, once so rare, now came easily. She looked over her shoulder and caught him watching her, his shoulder leaning against the doorframe, coffee in hand, barefoot and still blinking sleep from his eyes. They shared a glance that needed no words. The girls called for him, and he went to them without hesitation, dropping to the floor and immediately being assigned parts in their family picture drawing project. Each girl had a specific job. Amber drew the house, Lily the sky, and Hope the people. When they were done, they handed him the finished picture like it was a sacred scroll. In crayon and glitter glue was a little house, surrounded by 5 stick figures, 3 small girls with ponytails, a woman with long hair, and a tall man with messy scribbles on his head and a big blue heart drawn over his chest. Beneath it, written in uneven letters, was a single sentence: "This is our forever home." He swallowed hard. His heart, once hidden beneath walls of steel and silence, now beat openly in moments like this. Later that afternoon, they drove out to a small house on the edge of the city, one with a little garden, a real mailbox, and a wooden porch with chipped paint. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't even new. But it was theirs. Nicholas had bought it under all their names. Julia had helped choose every detail. The girls had already picked out the colors for their new bedrooms. Pink for Amber, purple for Lily, and blue for Hope. The walls would be covered in their drawings, their laughter, and the kind of memories no amount of wealth could manufacture. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the 5 of them sat together on the porch steps, popsicles melting down their hands, the air filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of children's giggles. Julia leaned her head against Nicholas's shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, kissing the top of her head as naturally as breathing. "I never thought we'd get here," she whispered. "Neither did I," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. "But now that we are, I'm never letting it go." And he meant it. Not just in the way people say things they hope are true, but in the way a man speaks when he's finally found everything he didn't know he was missing. A home. A family. A second chance he didn't deserve, but one he would spend the rest of his life earning, every single day. This ending feels like a quiet triumph, earned, not handed over. It doesn't rely on a grand romantic gesture or some unrealistic transformation, but instead leans into something much more powerful: consistency, accountability, and love built slowly, day by day. What makes it satisfying isn't that everything is suddenly perfect, but that the characters chose to heal together, even when it was hard. Nicholas didn't get a fairy tale redemption, he worked for it. Julia didn't forget the pain, she grew stronger around it. And the girls, without even knowing it, became the glue that rebuilt something broken into something beautiful. It's the kind of ending that reminds us the most powerful stories aren't about people who never fall, but about those who choose to stand up, stay, and do better.